Picture this: a tropical paradise on the brink of total economic collapse. A nation so deep in debt that it owed nearly 1.5 times everything it produced in an entire year. A country where the government was spending every single dollar just to pay interest on loans, leaving absolutely nothing for hospitals, schools, or roads. This wasn't some war-torn nation or failed state. This was Jamaica, the land of Bob Marley, beautiful beaches, and Olympic sprinters. And in 2013, it was about to become the Caribbean's greatest economic disaster. But what happened next defies everything economists thought they knew about financial recovery. In just 12 years, Jamaica pulled off what experts are calling the most incredible economic comeback in modern history. They didn't just survive their debt crisis, they obliterated it. They didn't just recover, they transformed into one of the most financially disciplined nations on Earth. And the numbers will shock you. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so we can reach 1,000 subscribers. Trust me, you're about to witness one of the most inspiring turnaround stories ever told, and you'll want to be part of this community that celebrates incredible human achievements. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, because Jamaica's story starts in the darkest possible place. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your entire country is essentially bankrupt. Not just struggling, not just having a bad year, but completely and utterly broke. That's exactly what Jamaica faced in 2013, and the numbers were so terrifying that international investors were literally running away from the island as fast as they could. Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio had exploded to an astronomical 146%. Let me put that in perspective for you. If Jamaica was a person earning $50,000 a year, they would owe $73,000. But here's the killer part. Almost every penny they earned was going straight to interest payments. Imagine working your entire life just to pay the interest on your credit cards, never actually reducing what you owe, never having money for food, shelter, or medicine. That was Jamaica's reality. Except we're talking about an entire nation of 3 million people. The situation was so dire that Jamaica couldn't even borrow money from regular banks anymore. Think about that for a moment. Banks, whose entire business is lending money, were looking at Jamaica and saying absolutely not. The country had become what economists call a financial pariah. International markets had completely lost faith. The Jamaican dollar was in free fall. Unemployment was skyrocketing. People were leaving the island in droves, taking their skills and dreams with them. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because Jamaica was about to make a deal that would either save the country or destroy it completely. They were about to shake hands with one of the most controversial organizations in the world, an institution that has been both praised as a lifesaver and condemned as an economic destroyer. The International Monetary Fund, better known as the IMF. Now, the IMF isn't your friendly neighborhood bank. Created in the aftermath of World War II, this global financial institution has 190 member countries, and when they show up at your door, it means you're in serious trouble. The IMF doesn't just lend money, they take control. They don't just offer suggestions, they impose conditions that can reshape entire societies. Some countries have thrived under IMF programs. Others have been crushed by them. Jamaica was about to find out which category they would fall into. The IMF looked at Jamaica's books and delivered a brutal assessment. The country was beyond broke. It was in economic free fall with no parachute. But they offered a lifeline, a massive bailout package worth nearly $1 billion. However, this wasn't charity. This was economic surgery without anesthesia, and the IMF was about to perform the most radical financial operation in Jamaica's history. The conditions were absolutely ruthless. Jamaica would have to maintain what economists call high primary surpluses. In simple terms, this meant the government had to collect more money in taxes than it spent on absolutely everything except interest payments. They had to completely overhaul their tax system, making it more efficient but also more painful for citizens. They had to restructure or sell off government-owned businesses that were bleeding money. And perhaps most controversially, they had to freeze public sector wages, meaning teachers, nurses, police officers, and civil servants would see their salaries frozen, while the cost of living continued to rise. These weren't suggestions or recommendations. These were non-negotiable demands. Miss any target, fail any review, and the money would stop flowing immediately. For a country already on life support, this would have meant economic death. So Jamaica signed on the dotted line, essentially handing over control of their economy to foreign technocrats in Washington, D.C. What happened next shocked everyone, including the IMF themselves. Most countries that enter these brutal austerity programs fail spectacularly. Citizens revolt against tax increases and spending cuts. Governments collapse under the pressure. Economies spiral deeper into recession. But Jamaica did something extraordinary. They didn't just survive the IMF treatment, they embraced it with a determination that stunned the world. Picture the sacrifice that ordinary Jamaicans made during this period. Government workers went years without pay raises, while inflation ate away at their purchasing power. Families had to choose between medicine and meals because of higher taxes. Small businesses closed because government contracts dried up. This wasn't just economic policy. This was asking an entire nation to endure years of hardship for the promise of a better future that might never come. But something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. While families were struggling and sacrificing, Jamaica's financial position was slowly, methodically improving. The government was actually collecting more money than it spent. The debt ratio began to decline for the first time in decades. International investors started to take notice. The Jamaican dollar stabilized. Most importantly, Jamaica was building something it hadn't had in years: credibility. By 2016, something unprecedented occurred. The IMF offered Jamaica a new type of arrangement, something called a precautionary standby agreement worth $1.6 billion. But here's the shocking part. Jamaica didn't need to take the money. They had turned the corner so dramatically that this massive loan package served as insurance rather than a necessity. It was like being approved for a credit card with a huge limit, but being financially stable enough that you might never need to use it. The transformation was beginning to show in real numbers that couldn't be disputed. From 2015 to 2019, Jamaica achieved something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier: 20 consecutive quarters of economic growth. Let me repeat that because it's so important. For 5 straight years, every 3 months, Jamaica's economy grew. This was the longest period of uninterrupted growth since the country began measuring quarterly statistics in 1997. To understand how remarkable this is, you need to know Jamaica's history. Before this incredible run, the country had never managed more than 9 consecutive quarters of growth. It was always 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Growth would start, then collapse. Investment would begin, then flee. Jobs would be created, then disappear. Jamaica was trapped in a cycle of false starts and economic disappointments that had lasted for decades. But now, something fundamentally different was happening. The economy wasn't just growing, it was growing steadily and predictably. Businesses could plan for the future. Families could make long-term decisions. Young people could envision careers without having to leave the island. Jamaica was experiencing something it hadn't felt in a generation: genuine economic stability. The debt numbers tell an incredible story of transformation. Remember that terrifying 146% debt-to-GDP ratio from 2013. By the early 2020s, it had dropped to levels that international economists considered manageable. Jamaica wasn't just paying down debt, they were doing it ahead of schedule. Every payment to the IMF was made on time. Every target was not just met, but exceeded. Every quarterly review was passed with flying colors. This wasn't luck or favorable global conditions. This was the result of the most disciplined fiscal policy in Jamaica's modern history. Successive governments, regardless of political party, maintained the same strict financial discipline. They resisted the political temptation to spend their way to popularity. They stayed committed to the painful but necessary reforms even when it meant making unpopular decisions. The human cost of this transformation cannot be understated. For over a decade, ordinary Jamaicans endured sacrifice after sacrifice. Public sector workers saw their real wages decline. Families paid higher taxes on everything from fuel to food. Government services were cut to the bone. Social programs were scaled back. This wasn't just an economic policy. It was asking an entire generation to sacrifice their immediate comfort for their children's future. But the sacrifices were beginning to pay dividends in ways that went far beyond debt statistics. Jamaica's newfound fiscal discipline was attracting international attention for all the right reasons. Credit rating agencies, the same organizations that had essentially written off Jamaica in 2013, were now upgrading the country's creditworthiness. International investors who had fled the island were returning with serious money and long-term commitments. The Jamaican dollar, which had been in perpetual free fall for decades, stabilized against major international currencies. This might sound technical, but for ordinary Jamaicans, it meant that prices for imported goods stopped rising uncontrollably. Families could budget for the future knowing that the cost of basic necessities wouldn't skyrocket overnight. Tourism, Jamaica's economic lifeline, began to flourish in ways it hadn't for years. But this wasn't just about more visitors, it was about better visitors. High-end resorts were expanding. Luxury cruise lines were adding Jamaica to their premium routes. International hotel chains were making major investments. The country that had been seen as financially unstable was now being viewed as a secure destination for serious tourism investment. As we moved into the 2020s, Jamaica's transformation became impossible to ignore. The same country that couldn't borrow money from anyone in 2013 was now accessing international capital markets at interest rates that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. This wasn't just financial improvement. This was a complete rehabilitation of Jamaica's international reputation. The IMF, an organization known for its skepticism and conservative projections, began using Jamaica as a success story. Here was a country that had taken their harshest medicine and not only survived but thrived. IMF officials who had once worried about Jamaica's ability to meet basic targets were now pointing to the island as proof that their programs could work when countries had the political will to see them through. But the most incredible milestone was still to come. By 2025, Jamaica's outstanding balance with the IMF had fallen to just 21.24 million special drawing rights, equivalent to about $28 million US. To put this in perspective, Jamaica had borrowed nearly $1 billion at the height of the crisis. They were now down to pocket change by international standards. This wasn't just debt reduction, this was financial liberation. For over a decade, Jamaica had lived under constant IMF supervision. Every major economic decision required approval from Washington. Every quarterly review could potentially cut off funding. Every policy choice was scrutinized by foreign technocrats. Jamaica's sovereignty had been voluntarily surrendered in exchange for financial survival. But now, that chapter was closing. Jamaica was about to pay off the IMF completely and regain full control over its economic destiny. The country that had been written off as a basket case was about to graduate from international supervision as one of the most financially disciplined nations in the developing world. The implications of this achievement extend far beyond Jamaica's borders. In an era when developing countries around the world are struggling with debt crises, Jamaica has provided a roadmap for recovery that other nations are studying intensively. They've proven that it's possible to dig out from seemingly impossible debt burdens without defaulting, without currency collapse, and without social revolution. Economic experts who once predicted Jamaica's inevitable default are now writing academic papers about the country's remarkable turnaround. International conferences feature Jamaica as a case study in successful debt management. The same economists who had given up on the island are now trying to understand exactly how this miracle was achieved. But perhaps most importantly, Jamaica has proven something profound about human nature and national character. When faced with an existential crisis, when every easy option has been exhausted, when the choice is between short-term comfort and long-term survival, people and nations can find reserves of discipline and determination that even they didn't know they possessed. The statistics behind Jamaica's transformation read like a financial fairy tale, but they represent real changes in real people's lives. Government debt as a percentage of GDP fell from that terrifying 146% to manageable levels. Interest payments, which once consumed virtually the entire government budget, were reduced to a fraction of expenditures, freeing up billions of dollars for education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Unemployment, which had reached crisis levels during the worst of the debt crisis, began falling consistently as businesses regained confidence and began hiring again. The brain drain that had seen Jamaica's best and brightest leave for opportunities elsewhere began to slow and even reverse as young professionals saw genuine opportunities at home. International trade relationships that had been strained by Jamaica's financial instability were restored and strengthened. The country that had struggled to find trading partners willing to extend credit was now negotiating from a position of strength. Export industries that had withered under economic uncertainty began expanding and investing in new capacity. The banking sector, which had been cautious and risk-averse during the crisis years, began lending again to businesses and individuals. This created a positive cycle where improved access to credit enabled business expansion, job creation, and economic growth that further improved the country's financial position. Foreign direct investment, the kind of long-term business investment that creates jobs and builds industries, began flowing back into Jamaica at levels not seen since before the crisis. International companies that had avoided the island due to economic uncertainty began establishing operations, bringing not just capital but technology, expertise, and global business connections. The energy sector, long a drag on Jamaica's economy due to dependence on expensive imported fuel, became a focus for improvement and diversification. Renewable energy projects that had been impossible to finance during the crisis years began moving forward, promising not just environmental benefits but long-term cost savings that would further strengthen the economy. Education, which had suffered under years of budget constraints, began seeing increased investment as government finances improved. New schools were built, teacher salaries were increased, and technology infrastructure was upgraded. This wasn't just about immediate improvements, but about building human capital for sustained long-term growth. Healthcare, another sector that had been severely impacted by fiscal austerity, began receiving the investment it desperately needed. Hospitals that had struggled with shortages of basic supplies began operating normally again. Medical equipment that had been deferred due to budget constraints was finally purchased and installed. Infrastructure projects that had been delayed or canceled during the crisis years began moving forward. Roads that had deteriorated due to lack of maintenance were repaired and upgraded. Ports and airports received investments that improved their capacity and efficiency. Communications infrastructure was modernized to support business growth and international connectivity. The social safety net, which had been reduced to bare bones during the austerity years, began expanding again as government revenues improved. Programs for the elderly, disabled, and unemployed were restored and enhanced. This represented not just policy improvements but a restoration of social solidarity that had been strained during the hardest years. As Jamaica approaches complete repayment of its IMF obligations, The country stands as a testament to what's possible when a nation makes difficult choices and sticks with them through years of hardship. The transformation from economic basket case to fiscal success story required sacrifices that touched every family and every community on the island. The political system proved remarkably resilient during this period, with successive governments of different parties maintaining the same basic fiscal discipline despite the political costs. This kind of policy continuity across electoral cycles is rare anywhere in the world and was absolutely crucial to Jamaica's success. International relationships that had been damaged by years of economic instability were not just restored but strengthened. Jamaica's reputation for meeting its commitments and managing its finances responsibly opened doors that had been closed for decades. Trade relationships, diplomatic partnerships, and cultural exchanges all benefited from the country's improved international standing. The private sector, which had struggled under economic uncertainty and limited access to credit, began flourishing in ways that surprised even optimistic observers. Small businesses that had barely survived the crisis years began expanding. New enterprises were launched by entrepreneurs who saw genuine opportunities in a stabilizing economy. The informal economy, which had expanded during the crisis as people struggled to make ends meet, began transitioning toward formal employment as legitimate job opportunities increased. This shift not only improved individual incomes, but also increased government tax revenues, creating a positive feedback loop that supported continued improvement. Regional relationships within the Caribbean were strengthened as Jamaica transformed from a source of economic concern to a model for financial management. Other Caribbean nations began studying Jamaica's policies and seeking advice on debt management and fiscal discipline. The diaspora community, Jamaicans living abroad who had maintained strong emotional ties to their homeland despite economic difficulties, began increasing their engagement and investment. Remittances increased, but more importantly, diaspora members began making direct investments in businesses and real estate as confidence in the economy returned. Tourism evolved beyond its traditional focus on sun and sand to include business tourism, medical tourism, and cultural tourism. The improved economic stability made Jamaica an attractive location for international conferences, business meetings, and specialized tourism that brought higher-value visitors and greater economic impact. Agricultural exports, long a strength of the Jamaican economy, began expanding into new markets as trade relationships improved and quality standards were enhanced. Coffee, sugar, bananas, and other traditional exports found new customers, while new products like organic produce and specialty foods began generating export revenue. Manufacturing, which had declined during the crisis years, began showing signs of recovery as domestic demand increased and export opportunities improved. Small-scale manufacturing for the domestic market expanded, while some industries began exploring export possibilities that had been impossible during the financially unstable years. The financial services sector, which had been conservative and risk-averse during the crisis, began expanding its services and customer base as economic conditions improved. Banks began offering more products, insurance companies expanded their coverage, and new financial service providers entered the market. Real estate, both residential and commercial, began recovering from the depressed values of the crisis years. Property values stabilized and then began rising in response to increased economic activity and improved confidence in the future. Construction activity increased, providing employment and supporting related industries. The creative industries, including music, film, and art, which had struggled during the economically difficult years, began flourishing again. Jamaica's cultural products found international markets as the country's improved stability made it a more reliable partner for international cultural collaboration. Technology, adoption, and innovation, which had been limited by economic constraints, began accelerating as businesses and individuals had more resources to invest in modern systems. Internet connectivity improved, mobile phone usage expanded, and digital business models began emerging. Environmental protection, often sacrificed during economic emergencies, began receiving proper attention as improved government finances allowed for investment in conservation and sustainable development programs. National parks were better maintained, environmental regulations were better enforced, and sustainable development projects received funding. The rule of law and institutional effectiveness, which can deteriorate during economic crises, actually improved as reduced financial stress allowed government institutions to function more effectively. Courts operated more efficiently, regulatory agencies had adequate resources, and public services improved across the board. Social cohesion, which had been strained during the years of economic hardship and sacrifice, began strengthening as the benefits of fiscal discipline became visible in improved living standards and expanded opportunities. The shared sacrifice during the difficult years created a sense of national pride in the achievement. As Jamaica prepares to make its final payments to the IMF and regain complete fiscal independence, the transformation represents more than just debt repayment. It represents a fundamental change in national character, from a country that lived beyond its means to one that exemplifies fiscal responsibility and long-term thinking. The lessons from Jamaica's experience resonate far beyond the Caribbean. In a world where debt crises are becoming increasingly common, Jamaica has demonstrated that even the most severe financial difficulties can be overcome with political will, social solidarity, and sustained commitment to difficult reforms. The success story that began with economic catastrophe and international bailouts concludes with a nation that has not only solved its debt crisis, but positioned itself for sustained growth and prosperity. Jamaica's impossible comeback from economic hell to fiscal freedom stands as one of the most remarkable national transformations in modern economic history, proving that with determination, sacrifice, and smart policy, even the most dire circumstances can be overcome. This is the story of how a small island nation refused to accept economic failure as its destiny, embraced the harshest medicine imaginable, and emerged stronger, more stable, and more prosperous than anyone thought possible. Jamaica's journey from the brink of financial collapse to IMF graduation is truly the impossible comeback that changed everything.